Chapter 28 is about where the story has gone from one of the previous chapters dealing with liberal religion. Remember when we talked about liberal religion and liberal Christianity, and we talked about the Renaissance, all those sorts of things? These guys are picking those themes up. And a lot of this is actually taking place in New England, but it becomes, there's a lot of things in New England are very important parts of the American character, the American story, and the concepts that Americans have of themselves. There's actually kind of a funny catchphrase that it's buried late in the chapter, but I'll read it to you right now. It's about the Universalists. And they say, Universalists were said to believe in the fatherhood of God. That's one thing. The brotherhood of man, and the neighborhood of Boston. Why? Because they were so centered in New England, and especially around the urban area. Boston was at that time a rival with New York for being one of the most important cities in the United States. Obviously, in our time, who won? New York, right? New York won a long time ago. But at that time, Boston was of equal importance to New York, if not greater importance. So we're looking at liberal movements, and what I particularly like about teaching this stuff is it's not just about religion, it's actually about philosophy. Quite a few of the people that we're going to look at fit into the history of American philosophy, these Transcendentalists, for example. Jonathan Edwards, first American philosopher. These guys are coming several generations later, and they're in certain ways heirs of Jonathan Edwards. And there is a distinctively American philosophical tradition. I actually went to a school that specialized in that when I was a graduate student, and so it's kind of nice to know about this sort of stuff and how philosophy and religion intersected with each other. So your book starts out by talking about religious liberalism, and we've already talked about that quite a bit. So I want to skip over some of that discussion. There is a tension that it brings up, though, and that's between, if we want to use really just simple words, between freedom and structure. Liberalism, understood in terms of religion, in terms of culture, in terms of politics, is usually for more freedom, for not having somebody telling you from the top down how you have to behave. Doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes liberals actually end up, becoming something sort of like their own form of fascists. There's actually a great book out there called Liberal Fascism by Jonah Goldberg, which makes a case for that sort of thing. But in general, the idea is to let people do what they want to do. Let them find what works for them. Let them figure out, in terms of religion, what they actually resonate with. And just because people decided something in the past doesn't mean that we're committed to it forever. We can change things to suit new times, to suit new problems that we hadn't thought of. That's inherent in the liberal idea. Now, what happens if you let anybody do anything they want? Let's say we get away from religion for a minute. How many of you belong to clubs of one form or another on campus? Okay, is there a structure to them? Like, do you have officers and there's a certain way of doing things? What happens if you don't stick to the structure?
Things fall apart.
How so?
The lack of structure, lack of guidance. People don't really know what direction to go and how to properly hold club meetings and stuff like that.
Yeah, even being able to hold a meeting, you can't have everybody talking at the same time. There has to be a certain way of doing things. I mean, some of them may actually use parliamentary procedure. Then it gets really, complicated. But most of the time, you have a few officers. The officers actually set the agenda. You meet at a certain time, not just whenever anybody feels like it in their dorm room. You can't have complete freedom. You need some level of structure or else things will fall apart. And these are kind of tough to reconcile with each other. Because every time that you make a rule, some people are going to be upset, right? Because you're impinging on their freedom. How many of you have seen problems in some of the clubs that you're in where people get bent out of shape because somebody's actually enforcing a rule? Have any of you seen that? I know I have. If you don't, that's a pretty good club. or at least you're having a good run. It's the same thing for these religious communities. And your book talks about two parallel religious movements emerging out of New England primarily, and they have to deal with this problem that's going to come up over and over again. So keep that in your mind as we're going through all of this. Now, these two communities are the Universalists and the Unitarians. And I sort of deliberately resisted the urge to put Unitarians over here because everybody always thinks the Unitarians are much more important. The Unitarians were really dominant in American culture in New England for a while. And not only dominant in culture, but also they tended to be from the upper class. So that helped out quite a bit as well. The Universalists tended to be more lower to middle class. Nowadays, they're actually both part of the one same church, the Unitarian Universalist Church. So if you look at, for them today, they merged back in the 1960s, and we'll talk about that bit of the story in a few moments. So the Unitarians, let's start out with that, because that's who your book starts out with. They trace their religious roots to Reformation free spirits, and then they were also influenced by, like your book says, the emergence in England beginning in the 17th century of a small group of Christians who denied that God existed as three people. Unitarians, they're Unitarians in opposition to Trinitarianism. Trinitarianism says that God is three persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, the Trinity, right? That's what most Christians are and have been throughout history. There have been some groups, like we talked about the Arians, a long time ago, who denied the divinity of Christ. They would have been Unitarians. So some people actually saw the Unitarian movement as a new type of Arianism, which that's really debatable. But in any case, that's one of their central tenets, that there isn't a Trinity. And what happens historically is the Great Awakening up in New England. We've got this history of the New Lights, the ones who are more emotional, the ones who are taking their inspiration from the newer theology. And then you have these opponents, the Old Lights. And the Old Lights are concentrated in Boston, and the other people are concentrated out in the hinterland, the rural areas. What happens is that the Old Lights become something completely different. When we hear old, we tend to think conservative. They're going to, stick with what they've got. For the Puritans, that would have been Calvinism, right? John Calvin, his notion of predestination, all the other things that goes along with that. They start to become critical of that as well. So they're critical of the emotional, heart-oriented worship. They're also critical of Calvinism, and they end up doing their own sort of thing. Like your book frames it, the most conspicuous teaching of the movement that took shape was the denial that God was a Trinity. More important was their equally determined assault on the Calvinist stress on the all-pervasive corrupting power of original sin, and its corollary, God's predestining of all humanity for salvation and damnation. So they're rejecting something really key to the narrative as they've seen it so far. They're rejecting, they're saying that God is one, three. They're rejecting original sin. They're rejecting predestination. And let's think about some of the corollaries that go along with this. Your book talks about this, but let's just sort of puzzle these out ourselves. It's a good exercise. So if God is one, what's this Jesus guy then? Yeah.
A prophet?
That would be one way to look at it. And that's actually the way in which Islam, earlier form of this, I don't want to say movement because they're not directly connected together, but tendency would frame it. The Unitarians didn't think of him so much as a prophet. Actually, let's hold off on that for a second. We can say this: he's human. That's it. He's not God. He's not the Son of God in any sort of metaphysical sense for the Unitarians. And then we'll think about what he might be in relation to this rejecting of original sin. So, if you reject the notion of original sin, that human beings are screwed up in pervasive ways that can't be overcome by self-help books or taking the right, medication or, just deciding to fix your life or changing society. But no matter what you do, human beings end up being screwed up. If you reject that notion, what are you left with? Human beings are fundamentally good, right? And the goal then is to quit being such jerks to each other and start, doing things more rationally and learn how to be ethical, as we say. So if that's one of the key goals, who's this Jesus guy? He's not a prophet. What would his role have been? Because remember, he's wandering around saying things to crowds and, leading an example. Yeah, go ahead.
Preacher?
What's he preaching? That's very good. You're on the right track. He's not preaching stuff about don't mix the meat and dairy like the kosher law. As a matter of fact, the early Christians ended up rejecting the kosher law. So what's left after you take away all the ceremonial stuff? Yeah.
Stories about love and tolerance.
Stories about love and tolerance, yeah. Some other stories too, which aren't so much about love and tolerance, but they are about right and wrong, right? And how should you behave? Again, think about the Sermon on the Mount and some of the stuff that this guy says that just blows people's minds. Like, if your brother wrongs you, don't take him to court because the judge, might actually lock you both up. He was paraphrasing. Or it's a sin. Some people say that you shouldn't kill. I say that you shouldn't even feel anger towards your brother. And that if you call him Racha, which basically translates into jackass or fool or something like that, you're actually doing a terrible thing. Basically like killing him. That's a very tough moral code to live up to. Jesus is all about ethics in that case. All about how to live a better life. And now, if you reject predestination, what does that mean? So, predestination was this idea that everybody's either going individually, not as a whole. Everyone's either going to the good place or to the bad place, and there's nothing you can do about it. If you're going to the good place, we'll figure that out because you'll live a good life. If you're going to the bad place, even if you want to be a good person, you're still going to hell. Take that away now. And what are you left with? What's the opposite of that in terms of sort of your spiritual path? Free will. You get to control where you're going. You decide whether you're a good person or a bad person, whether you develop or degenerate. And so this is all these are all corollaries to this, and that's what the Unitarians really emphasized. Your book talks about a few important characters in here. One would be this William Ellery Channing, who preaches this sermon about the unity of God and his parental character, the single human nature of Jesus, individual free will, the moral and ethical character of the Christian religion, all the things that we just talked about a minute ago. They start to form into the American Unitarian Association. And the next person on the scene who's particularly important, who I think some of you may have read, is Ralph Waldo Emerson. Have any of you read any of his essays? You at least heard of him, right? He's also a Transcendentalist figure. You might have, in your American Lit class come across him. He gives this divinity school address, and in it, he's questioning the miracles attributed to Jesus in the Gospels. Now, why would he be doing that? Sort of like Thomas Jefferson, right? Jefferson Bible, take out all the miracles. Why would you want to do that? Well, the idea is, if the world by itself is already sort of inhabited by God and pervaded by God, you don't need miracles. Why would God make things rest on what happened with just this person at this time? Why wouldn't God offer a message that's universally accessible to everybody through nature? And Emerson leads us to something else that kind of fits in here in the middle, and that's this Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism is a little bit shorter lived. You don't get a Transcendentalist church out of this, you have a Transcendentalist movement. So Emerson would be a key guy in this. Henry David Thoreau. Did any of you read Walden in high school or middle school? No? It's a good book, worth reading. He's out there and he goes out. Usually people read it nowadays because they want to be like back to nature sorts. They want to be like Thoreau, get themselves a little shack somewhere and just can things and hang out and don't mix with other people. Not Unabomber style, but more like happy style. But for Thoreau, the goal was to strip away civilization so he could hear the voice of God out there in nature and sort of have this religious experience. He ends up writing a lot about what he buys and what he makes and things like that. There's not quite so much religion in it as you might expect, but it's worth reading. The Transcendentalists are coming from, it's a philosophical movement, they're coming from the Transcendental philosophy, which is coming from Germany through England. So if you remember back to your intro to philosophy class, if you had that, Kant, people like Immanuel Kant, if you read him, a very tough read, hard to figure out what he's talking about, even for us college professors. Oh, it wasn't hard for you?
Yeah, I just wrote a paper on ethical egoism, Unitarianism, and Kantian ethics as well. I didn't think it was too bad.
Well, there you go. Then maybe you should be teaching it. We may have a recruit. Anyway, this philosophy says, here's a great summary of it in your book. The central emphasis of Transcendentalism was on the human ability to enter into a deeper, more original relationship with the ultimate reality that underlies appearances and is present everywhere in nature. That's the transcendental. And so how do human beings experience that? Well, it could be through intuition, could be through music and artwork. Some people got into using drugs to try to access this. The hippies were not the first ones to think about doing that sort of thing. They actually took some of their cues from a few of the fringe people with this. Human history, customs, and institutions, including organized religion, hindered rather than helped this quest. So you'd want to get away from that in order to experience divinity, to experience God, or whatever it is that you're looking for, the spiritual. So Emerson and Thoreau are central to this. It talks about a few other people who kind of fit in with that, including some who are critics or satirizing it, like Nathaniel Hawthorne, who you might have come across, or Herman Melville. Talks about the fireside poets. You probably haven't read them because very few people do read them anymore. But then it also talks about, going back to Unitarianism, what were these people about? They're about progress. They're about reform. They're about some of the things that we've been talking about in other chapters. Now we want to look at Universalism. Universalism is a little bit easier to sum up. Universalism, what's the universal in that? I'm going to put JC so I don't have to write the whole word out. Everybody knows who JC is, right? Not JC Penney. Okay. The universal in this is God is going to save everybody. And they are Christians, so they think that Jesus is involved in this somehow. Eventually, that starts to get kind of fuzzy, and it's more about God saving everybody. So Universalists will say things like, well, hell doesn't really exist. Or some would say, hell is just for a little while, and then you get out of it after you've done your time, which makes it sound a lot more like purgatory, doesn't it? The long and short of it is that their view of God is this very optimistic, loving. God will save every single human being, no matter how bad. And the book talks about a few key documents and thinkers. There's Hosea Ballou, who writes a treatise on the atonement, the Winchester profession, and they eventually become the Universalist Church of America. They are not as well heeled as the Unitarians, but they actually have a lot of growth at the beginning, not so much later on. They actually shrink a bit. By the 1960s, and that's really telescoping a lot of time, both of these groups have realized that they're really on the same page about most of their doctrines and most of what they're interested in, that they have parallel organizations, that they're spending a lot of money on this, and that it might be better for them to actually just merge and become the Unitarian Universalists. That's what happens. So when you see a Unitarian church today, it's really a Unitarian Universalist church.